The rustle of autumn leaves echoed across the prairie as Fiona Bennett squinted into the setting sun, her silhouette stark against the fading light as she balanced atop the weathered fence post surrounding her family's modest ranch. Arizona Territory, 1882, was no place for a woman alone, but the vast emptiness of the frontier had become her only comfort since Pa's passing last winter. Fiona's calloused fingers gripped the rough wood beneath her, her worn blue cotton dress fluttering in the evening breeze. 3 months of managing the struggling cattle ranch by herself had hardened her in ways she never expected. 22 years old and already feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders, she watched the horizon with weary eyes, searching for answers in the painted sky. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke her reverie. Fiona tensed, one hand instinctively reaching for the small pistol hidden in the folds of her dress. Lone riders at dusk rarely brought good news. The man who came into view rode tall on a magnificent chestnut stallion. His broad shoulders were silhouetted against the crimson sunset, face partially obscured by the shadow of his worn Stetson. As he approached, Fiona could make out the dust-covered denim of his pants, the leather chaps that had seen better days, and a gun belt that hung low on his hips. He slowed his horse to a stop several yards from where she sat. For a moment, neither spoke, sizing each other up across the distance. The stranger removed his hat, revealing sun-bleached hair that fell in unruly waves around a face weathered by sun and wind. His eyes, a startling blue even in the dim light, regarded her with curious intensity. "Evening, madam," he called, his voice deep and resonant. "Xavier Caldwell, people call me Zav." He gestured toward the ranch house visible in the distance. "This the Bennett place." Fiona straightened her spine, refusing to show any sign of the alarm bells ringing in her head. "It is, and I'm Fiona Bennett. What business brings you here, Mr. Caldwell?" A half-smile tugged at the corner of his mouth as he urged his horse forward a few steps. "Your father hired me. Got his letter about 6 weeks back in Tucson. Said he needed help with the ranch, offered fair pay and a place to stay." The smile faded as he studied her face more carefully. "From your expression, I'm guessing he never mentioned me." Fiona swallowed hard. "My father passed away 3 months ago, Mr. Caldwell. Pneumonia took him quick." She watched his face fall, saw a genuine regret flash in those blue eyes. "Whatever arrangements you had with him died along with him. I'm sorry you rode all this way for nothing." Xavier removed his hat again, held it against his chest. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Bennett." Frederick Bennett was spoken of highly in these parts. The mention of her father's name brought an unexpected lump to Fiona's throat. She nodded curtly, unwilling to let this stranger see her vulnerability. "Thank you." "Now, if you'll excuse me, with all due respect, madam," Xavier interrupted, replacing his hat and straightening in his saddle. "I've ridden 300 miles to get here, and my horse and I could use some rest before heading back out. Would you allow me to at least water my horse and perhaps camp on your property for the night? I'll be gone by morning." Fiona hesitated. The sensible thing would be to send him away immediately. A woman alone couldn't be too careful in these parts. But something in his direct gaze, the respectful way he kept his distance, made her reconsider. "There's a stream behind the barn," she said finally. "You can make camp there for the night, but I expect you gone by sunrise." He nodded, tipping his hat. "Much obliged, Miss Bennett." As Xavier turned his horse toward the barn, Fiona called after him. "Mr. Caldwell, what exactly did my father hire you to do?" He looked back over his shoulder. "Cattle drive. Said he had a herd ready to take to market in Prescott but needed an experienced hand to help get them there." Fiona felt a flutter of something between hope and anxiety. Pa had indeed been planning that cattle drive before he fell ill. 50 head of prime beef cattle that represented the ranch's entire income for the year. They needed to be taken to market before winter, but she couldn't manage a drive alone, and hiring local help had proven impossible with the silver mines drawing away able-bodied men with promises of better pay. She watched Xavier Caldwell disappear around the side of the barn, his straight back and confident posture marking him as a man who knew his business. Maybe, just maybe, fate had sent her an answer to her prayers. The night passed uneventfully, though Fiona slept fitfully, her father's shotgun propped beside her bed. At first light, she dressed quickly in her work clothes, a simple skirt with men's trousers underneath, a concession to practicality she'd adopted after Pa's death, and headed out to the barn to begin her morning chores. To her surprise, Xavier was already there, fork in hand, mucking out the horse stalls. "Mr. Caldwell," she said sharply, "I don't recall inviting you to make yourself at home in my barn." He looked up, a lock of hair falling across his forehead. "Thought I'd make myself useful before heading out. Your horses needed feeding, and that bay mare has a loose shoe that needs tending." He leaned the pitchfork against the wall. "I'll be on my way as soon as I'm finished here." Fiona crossed her arms, studying him in the morning light. He was younger than she'd first thought, probably no more than 30. His features were striking rather than handsome strong jaw, straight nose that might have been broken once, and those eyes that seemed to take in everything. Most notably, there was nothing threatening in his manner, just the easy confidence of a man comfortable with hard work. "Do you really know cattle?" she asked abruptly. He raised an eyebrow. "Born and raised on a cattle ranch in Texas. Worked drives from the Panhandle to Kansas City since I was 16. So yes, madam, I know cattle." Fiona chewed her bottom lip, considering. The cattle drive couldn't wait much longer. The first snow could come as early as November in these parts, and the herd needed to be in Prescott before then. "My father was planning to pay $15 for the drive, plus room and board while preparations were made," she said carefully. "I can honor that arrangement, Mr. Caldwell, but I'll be going with you." Now both his eyebrows shot up. "No offense intended, Miss Bennett, but cattle drives aren't exactly suitable for a woman," she finished, her tone cooling. "Perhaps not. But these are my cattle, Mr. Caldwell, and I don't intend to entrust my entire livelihood to a stranger without supervision. I've been running this ranch alone for 3 months. I can ride and shoot, and I know every one of those cattle by sight." Xavier studied her for a long moment, taking in her determined stance and the flash of fire in her green eyes. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled, a real smile that transformed his face. "Your father mentioned you were spirited," he said. "Guess he wasn't exaggerating. You'll take the job then, with me accompanying the drive," he nodded slowly. "On one condition. You follow my lead when it comes to handling the herd and dealing with whatever trouble we might encounter on the trail. A cattle drive can turn dangerous mighty quick." Fiona extended her hand. "Agreed, Mr. Caldwell, we leave in 5 days." His large hand enveloped hers, warm and calloused. "Call me Xav, Miss Bennett. If we're going to be trail partners, we might as well be on familiar terms." "Fiona," she replied, withdrawing her hand and ignoring the lingering sensation of his touch. "You can call me Fiona." The next 5 days passed in a flurry of activity. Xavier proved himself to be everything he'd claimed: knowledgeable, hardworking, and surprisingly easy to be around. He helped Fiona repair fences, checked over the cattle, and showed her tricks for packing that would make the journey easier. By unspoken agreement, they avoided personal questions, focusing instead on the task ahead. On the morning of their departure, Fiona stood on the porch of the ranch house, taking one last look at the only home she'd ever known. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her shoulders. If anything happened to these cattle, if she couldn't get them to market, she would lose everything. "Having second thoughts?" Xavier asked quietly, coming to stand beside her. He'd cleaned up for the journey, his face freshly shaven, hair trimmed neatly beneath his hat. "No," she said firmly, though her stomach churned with anxiety. "Just saying goodbye for now," he nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Your father built a fine place here. We'll make sure it stays yours." Something about the way he said "we" made her heart lighten. For the first time since Pa died, Fiona didn't feel completely alone. They set out at dawn. the cattle lowing softly as they were driven from the familiar pastures onto the trail heading north. Xavier rode at the front of the herd, while Fiona took up position at the rear, keeping the stragglers moving. The first day passed without incident, though by evening, every muscle in Fiona's body ached from hours in the saddle. They made camp in a small valley with good grazing for the cattle and a clear stream nearby. Xavier built a fire and prepared a simple supper of beans, bacon, and coffee that tasted better than anything Fiona had eaten in months. "My compliments to the chef," she said, accepting a second cup of coffee from him. The night had turned cold and she huddled closer to the fire, grateful for its warmth. Xavier smiled, the firelight casting shadows across his face. "Trail cooking's about the only kind I know. My mother despaired of ever teaching me proper kitchen skills." "Is she still in Texas, your mother?" Fiona asked, realizing this was the first personal detail he'd offered. A shadow crossed his features. "No, lost both my parents to cholera when I was 18. Had to sell the ranch to pay off Pa's debts. Been drifting ever since, working cattle wherever I can find a job." "I'm sorry," Fiona said softly. "Losing a parent leaves a hole nothing seems to fill." He nodded, his eyes meeting hers across the flames. "It does at that. But you're doing right by your father, keeping his place going. That takes courage, or stubbornness," she replied with a small smile. "Pa always said I had more than my share of that," Xavier chuckled. "Stubbornness is just courage that won't quit. You'll need plenty of both to make it in this country." They fell into comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds around them, the occasional lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the grass, the pop and crackle of burning wood. Fiona found herself studying Xavier's profile, the strong lines of his face softened by firelight. There was something comforting about his presence, a quiet strength that made her feel safer than she had in months. "We should get some sleep," he said eventually, breaking into her thoughts. "Tomorrow's a long day," Fiona nodded, suddenly self-conscious about staring. "I'll take first watch with the herd." "No need," he replied, rising to his feet. "I've already arranged it. Cattle seem calm tonight, but I'll check on them every couple hours. You get some rest." "I'm perfectly capable," she began, but he cut her off with a raised hand. "I know you are, but you're also exhausted and we need you sharp tomorrow. Trust me on this, Fiona. It's not about you being a woman, it's about you being human. Everyone needs rest." Too tired to argue, Fiona retreated to her bedroll, spreading it near enough to the fire for warmth, but with a respectful distance from Xavier's. As she drifted toward sleep, she found herself wondering about this man who had walked into her life so unexpectedly. There was a gentleness to him that belied his rough exterior, a thoughtfulness she hadn't expected. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. They rose before dawn, had a quick breakfast of coffee and whatever they could prepare quickly, then got the herd moving by first light. The cattle proved to be mostly cooperative, though there were occasional strays to round up and minor crises to manage. Xavier was a patient teacher, showing Fiona techniques for guiding the herd and handling difficult animals without ever making her feel incompetent. On the fourth day, disaster struck. They were crossing a shallow river when thunder rumbled in the distance. The lead cattle, already nervous from the water crossing, suddenly spooked. Before either Fiona or Xavier could react, the entire herd was stampeding, breaking away from the river in a chaotic mass of horns and hooves. "Head them off." Xavier shouted over the thunder of running cattle, spurring his horse toward the front of the herd. "Try to turn them in a circle." Heart-pounding, Fiona urged her horse forward, racing alongside the terrified animals. Rain began to fall, fat drops that quickly turned into a downpour, making visibility poor and the ground treacherous. She could barely see Xavier through the curtain of water, just glimpses of his horse as he worked to turn the leaders. A flash of lightning split the sky, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. Fiona's horse reared in terror, nearly throwing her. She clung to the saddle, desperately trying to regain control as the animal came back down on all fours and bolted. She lost sight of the herd, lost sight of everything except the rain-soaked ground flying beneath her horse's hooves. A jutting rock appeared suddenly in their path. The horse tried to swerve but slipped in the mud. Fiona felt herself being thrown, had one terrible moment of clarity as she sailed through the air, then impact hard and jarring as she hit the ground. Pain exploded through her left arm and side. She lay stunned, rain pelting her face, struggling to breathe through the shock. Distantly, she could hear her horse galloping away, but she couldn't move, couldn't call out. How long she lay there, she couldn't say. The storm moved on, the rain easing to a drizzle, then stopping altogether. Fiona managed to sit up, cradling her injured arm against her chest. Nothing felt broken, but her entire side throbbed with a deep, persistent ache. "Fiona, Fiona," Xavier's voice carried through the clearing air, and she had never been so relieved to hear another human being. "Here." She called, her voice weaker than she'd intended. "I'm over here." Minutes later, he appeared, riding hard through the scattered trees, leading her horse behind him. His face was a mask of concern that deepened when he saw her on the ground. He was off his horse in an instant, kneeling beside her in the mud. "Are you hurt? What happened?" "Horse spooked at the lightning," she explained, wincing as he gently examined her arm. "Threw me when he slipped. I think it's just bruised, not broken." His hands were careful as they moved over her arm, checking for injuries. "Can you stand?" With his help, Fiona got to her feet, swaying slightly as a wave of dizziness washed over her. Xavier's arm went around her waist, steadying her against his side. "The cattle," she remembered suddenly. "Did we lose them all?" A faint smile touched his lips. "Give me some credit, Miss Bennett. Got them turned and settled about half a mile back. They're grazing peacefully now that the storm's passed." Relief flooded through her. "Thank God and thank you. Don't thank me yet. We need to get you dry," and that arm looked it properly. His arm tightened slightly around her waist. "Think you can ride?" Fiona nodded, though the prospect of getting back on a horse made her stomach clench. Xavier must have seen her hesitation because he shook his head. "You'll ride with me. We'll lead your horse." Before she could protest, he'd lifted her onto his stallion, then swung up behind her. His chest was warm against her back, his arms creating a secure circle as he reached around her for the reins. Despite her discomfort, Fiona found herself relaxing into his solid presence as they rode back toward the herd. They made camp early that day. Xavier insisted on setting up a proper shelter for Fiona using a tarp and some branches, then built a roaring fire to help dry their sodden clothes and gear. He prepared a more substantial meal than usual: biscuits, dried beef reconstituted in a stew with the last of their potatoes, and strong coffee laced with a medicinal whiskey he produced from his saddlebags. "For the pain," he explained, passing her the cup. "Not very ladylike, I know, but it helps." Fiona took a cautious sip, grimacing at the burn. "I stopped worrying about being ladylike the day I had to help birth a calf in the middle of a snowstorm," Xavier chuckled, settling beside her near the fire. "Your father taught you well." "He had to," she replied, taking another sip of the fortified coffee. "Ma died when I was 12. It was just the two of us after that, and Pa said he wasn't raising any hothouse flower that couldn't pull her own weight." "He'd be proud of you," Xavier said quietly. "Not many women or men, for that matter, would take on a cattle drive with just one hired hand." Fiona looked into the dancing flames, wondering if that was true. "I don't know about that. I nearly got myself killed today, and I might have lost the entire herd if not for you." "We all make mistakes, especially our first time out." His voice was gentle. "The important thing is you got back up. That's what separates those who survive out here from those who don't." She turned to look at him, really look at him in the firelight. His hair was still damp from the rain, curling slightly at the nape of his neck. There was a day's worth of stubble shadowing his jaw, and a small scar she hadn't noticed before beside his left eyebrow. But it was the kindness in his eyes that caught and held her attention. "Why are you being so nice to me?" she asked abruptly. "You could have just taken the cattle yourself after I fell, driven them to market and kept all the profit." Surprise flickered across his face, followed by something that might have been hurt. "Is that what you think of me? That I'd steal from a woman who's just lost her father?" "No," she admitted. "No, I don't think that, but most men would consider me a burden, especially after today." Xavier was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and thoughtful. "My mother used to say you can tell a person's true character by how they treat those who can't benefit them. I've tried to live by that." He glanced at her. "Besides, you're no burden, Fiona Bennett. You're one of the bravest, most determined people I've ever met." A little accident doesn't change that. Warmth that had nothing to do with the fire or the whiskey spread through Fiona's chest. No one had spoken to her that way since Pa died, like she was valuable, like she mattered as more than just the owner of a struggling ranch. "Thank you," she said softly, unable to find better words. He nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Get some rest. We've still got a long road to Prescott." The next morning, Fiona woke to find her arm stiff but less painful. Xavier had already prepared breakfast and was checking the herd when she emerged from her makeshift shelter. He greeted her with a smile that seemed to brighten the entire camp. "How's the arm?" he asked, pouring her a cup of coffee. "Better," she replied, accepting the cup gratefully. "I'll be able to ride today." "Good to hear, but we'll take it slow, give you time to recover." They resumed their journey at a more leisurely pace. Xavier kept the cattle moving steadily but without pushing them, and he positioned himself where he could keep an eye on both the herd and Fiona. She caught him watching her several times throughout the day, his gaze concerned and attentive. That evening, as they sat by the campfire, Fiona found herself telling Xavier about her life on the ranch, the good years when she and Pa had worked side by side, the bad years when drought had nearly ruined them, the precious memories of her mother that were beginning to fade no matter how hard she tried to hold on to them. "What about you?" she asked eventually. "You've heard my whole life story, but I know almost nothing about you." Xavier poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks flying upward. "Not much to tell. After my parents died and I lost the ranch, I drifted. Worked cattle drives, did some scouting for the army, even tried my hand at mining for a spell." He shrugged. "Never stayed in one place long enough to put down roots." "No wife waiting somewhere?" Fiona asked, surprising herself with her boldness. A shadow crossed his face. "There was someone once, Emily. We were going to get married when I came back from a drive, but..." He trailed off, staring into the flames. "She found someone else while I was gone, someone more steady with prospects. Can't blame her, really. A woman needs security, not a wandering cowboy with empty pockets." "I'm sorry," Fiona said softly, understanding now the hint of sadness she sometimes caught in his eyes. He shrugged again, trying to appear unaffected. "It was years ago, water under the bridge." But Fiona sensed it wasn't, not entirely. She wondered what kind of woman could let a man like Xavier Caldwell slip away. There was something rare about him, a fundamental decency, a quiet strength that seemed increasingly precious in this harsh land. "What about you?" he asked, turning the question back on her. "No suitors lining up at the Bennett Ranch," Fiona laughed, the sound surprising even herself. "Hardly. The closest town is 20 miles away, and most of the men there think a woman running a ranch on her own is either desperate or deranged. The few who have come calling were more interested in my land than in me." "Their loss," Xavier said simply, his eyes meeting hers across the fire. Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition, an acknowledgement of the connection that had been growing since that first evening when he'd ridden up to her fence. Fiona felt her cheeks warm, and it had nothing to do with the fire's heat. "We should get some sleep," she said, suddenly needing distance from the intensity of his gaze. Xavier nodded, but as she rose to go to her bedroll, he spoke again. "Fiona, I'm glad your father wrote to me. Even if he's not here to see it through, I'm glad I came." She paused, looking back at him. "So am I, Xav, so am I." The remainder of their journey was mercifully uneventful. The weather held fair, the cattle remained cooperative, and day by day, Fiona's confidence grew. Xavier continued to teach her the finer points of cattle driving, and she proved to be a quick study. More importantly, the easy companionship between them deepened, conversations flowing from practical matters to personal histories, to philosophical debates about everything from politics to the proper way to cook beans. By the time they reached the outskirts of Prescott, Fiona realized with a start that she would miss these long days on the trail with Xavier, the shared meals, the quiet evenings by the fire, the comfort of his steady presence. Prescott in 1882 was a bustling town, the territorial capital filled with government officials, businessmen, miners, and ranchers. The cattle auction was held at the edge of town, where stockyards had been built to accommodate the herds brought in from ranches throughout the territory. Xavier helped Fiona negotiate with the buyers, his knowledge of market prices proving invaluable. By midday, they had sold the entire herd for a better price than Fiona had dared hope enough to pay off her father's outstanding debts and see the ranch through until next year's drive. "We did it," she said, clutching the bank draft in her hand as they stood outside the first bank of Prescott. "I can't believe we actually did it." Xavier smiled down at her, pride evident in his expression. "You did it, Fiona. These were your cattle, your drive. I just helped out a bit." "More than a bit," she corrected, impulsively reaching out to squeeze his hand. "I couldn't have done this without you, Xav." His fingers closed around hers briefly before he released her hand. "We make a good team." They checked into the Prescott Hotel's separate rooms, of course, though the clerk had raised his eyebrows when Fiona requested her own accommodation. After weeks on the trail, the prospect of a real bed, a hot bath, and a proper meal was almost overwhelming. "Meet you in the dining room at 7. Xavier suggested as they parted in the hotel hallway. "We should celebrate our successful drive." Fiona nodded, suddenly acutely aware of her trail-worn appearance and disheveled hair. 7 it is. In her room, she indulged in the luxury of a hot bath, washing away weeks of dust and grime. The hotel had provided lavender-scented soap, and she used it liberally, scrubbing until her skin glowed pink. She washed her hair twice, then combed it out carefully, letting it dry in loose waves down her back. Her options for dinner attire were limited, as she'd packed only practical clothing for the drive. The nicest thing she had was a simple blue dress she'd brought along in case they attended church in Prescott before heading back. It was plain compared to what the town ladies would be wearing, but it was clean and fit her well enough. When she entered the hotel dining room at 7 sharp, Fiona scanned the tables nervously, half expecting Xavier to have changed his mind. Then she saw him, standing as she approached, and her breath caught in her throat. He'd cleaned up remarkably well. His hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaven, and he wore a crisp white shirt with a dark vest and trousers that looked new. But it was the way he was looking at her that made her heart beat faster, as if he'd never seen anything quite so wonderful. "You look beautiful," he said simply as he held her chair. "Thank you," she replied, feeling strangely shy. "You clean up pretty well yourself." Dinner was the finest meal Fiona had eaten in years: roast beef, potatoes, fresh vegetables, and apple pie for dessert. They lingered over coffee, neither seeming eager for the evening to end. Xavier told stories that made her laugh, describing some of the more colorful characters he'd encountered in his travels. Fiona found herself watching his hands as he talked strong, capable hands that had guided horses, tended cattle, built fires, and once gently examined her injured arm. "What happens now?" she asked finally as the dining room began to empty around them. "Will you be moving on to another job?" Xavier's expression grew serious. "That depends." "On what?" He took a deep breath as if gathering his courage. "On whether there might be a reason for me to stay." Fiona's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of reason?" His eyes held hers across the table. "A compelling one. A reason with green eyes and more courage than any 10 men I've ever known." Heat flooded Fiona's cheeks. "Xav, I know it's sudden," he continued, his voice low and earnest. "We've only known each other a few weeks. But out on the trail, you get to know a person's true character pretty quick, and what I've seen of yours, Fiona Bennett, makes me want to know a whole lot more. Are you saying you want to court me, Mr. Caldwell? She asked, struggling to keep her tone light despite the rapid hammering of her heart. A slow smile spread across his face. That's exactly what I'm saying, Miss Bennett, with your permission, of course. Fiona thought about the long ride back to the ranch, the quiet evenings that awaited her there, evenings that would feel emptier now that she knew what it was like to have Xavier's company. She thought about the way he looked at her, as if she were precious and strong all at once. She thought about how it felt to trust someone again after months of carrying every burden alone. I think, she said carefully, that my father would have approved of you staying on at the ranch. As foreman, perhaps, it would give us time to get better acquainted. The smile that lit Xavier's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. I'd be honored, Miss Bennett, though I should warn you, I intend to be very thorough in our acquaintance. After dinner, they walked through the streets of Prescott, the cool evening air a pleasant contrast to the warmth between them. They talked of practical things, what repairs the ranch needed, how many cattle they should keep for breeding, whether to expand into horses. But beneath the practical conversation ran a current of anticipation, of possibilities neither was quite ready to name. When they reached Fiona's door, Xavier took her hand and raised it to his lips. "Good night, Fiona," he said softly. "Sleep well." The brush of his lips against her skin sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the night air. "Good night, Xav." The journey back to the ranch was different, somehow lighter, filled with shared glances and small touches that might have seemed accidental to an observer but held meaning for them. They took their time, enjoying the last days of autumn weather before winter closed in. On the final evening before reaching the ranch, they made camp on a rise overlooking a valley painted gold and crimson with changing leaves. After dinner, Fiona found herself drawn to the edge of the rise, gazing out at the spectacular sunset. Xavier joined her, standing close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "Quite a view," he commented. "It is," she agreed. "Sometimes I forget how beautiful this country can be when I'm too busy worrying about keeping the ranch going. That's what partners are for," he said. To remind each other to stop and look at the sunset once in a while, Fiona turned to him, studying his profile in the fading light. "Is that what we are, partners?" Xavier met her gaze, his expression more serious than she'd ever seen it. "I'd like us to be, in all ways that matter." Something in his tone made her heart race. "Xav." He took her hands in his touch gentle but secure. "I know it hasn't been long, Fiona, but sometimes you just know when something's right. When I'm with you, everything makes sense in a way it never has before. You make me want to stop wandering and build something that lasts." Fiona's throat tightened with emotion. "I never thought I'd meet someone who understood what the ranch means to me, who wouldn't ask me to be something I'm not." "I wouldn't change a thing about you," he said, his thumbs tracing circles on the backs of her hands. "Your strength, your determination, even your stubbornness, they're all part of what makes you Fiona Bennett." She laughed softly. "And here I was thinking I might need to soften some of those rough edges." "Don't you dare," he said with a grin. Then, more seriously, "All I ask is that you let me share the load sometimes. Let me be there for you the way you've been there for your father's ranch." Fiona felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. She blinked them back, not wanting Xavier to misunderstand. "I'm not very good at letting people help me." "I noticed," he said dryly, "but I'm a patient man." "Are you?" she asked, a teasing note entering her voice. Because sometimes on the trail, when the cattle were being difficult, he silenced her with a kiss, gentle at first, then deeper as she responded, her hands moving to his shoulders. When they finally broke apart, both breathing more quickly, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since I saw you sitting on that fence post," he admitted. "I'm glad you waited," she replied. "If you'd tried it then, I might have shot you," he laughed, the sound rich and warm in the gathering twilight. "That's my Fiona, always practical." The next day they arrived back at the Bennett ranch. As they rode up to the main house, Fiona was struck by how different everything looked, not because anything had changed, but because she had. The woman who had sat alone on the fence post 2 months ago, weighted down by responsibility and grief, was not the same woman who now rode beside Xavier Caldwell, her heart lighter than it had been in years. They stabled the horses and unpacked their gear in companionable silence. When everything was put away, Xavier walked Fiona to the porch of the main house. "I'll get settled in the foreman's cabin," he said. "It'll need some fixing up, but it'll do fine." Fiona nodded, suddenly reluctant to see him go, even for the short distance to the small cabin where her father's previous foreman had lived. "Thank you, Xav, for everything." He touched her cheek gently. "Thank you for trusting me, Fiona, with your cattle and with your heart. I promise I'll take good care of both." As Xavier walked toward the foreman's cabin, Fiona stood on the porch watching him go, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. For the first time since her father's death, the future seemed bright with promise rather than heavy with obligation. The weeks that followed settled into a new rhythm. Xavier proved to be as skilled at ranch management as he was at cattle driving. He repaired fences, tended sick animals, and helped Fiona implement improvements they had discussed on the journey back from Prescott. In the evenings, they often shared dinner, talking about the day's work and making plans for the ranch's future. Their courtship progressed steadily, with Xavier showing the same patience and consideration in matters of the heart as he did in all things. There were rides across the property on clear days, picnic lunches by the stream, and long conversations by the fire in the evening. Each day, Fiona found herself falling deeper in love with this quiet, steadfast man who had walked into her life when she needed him most. As winter settled over the Arizona territory, bringing cooler temperatures but little snow to their southern location, Xavier began spending more evenings at the main house. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, Fiona reading while Xavier whittled or cleaned tack. Other times, they played cards or checkers, their competitive spirits making for lively matches. On Christmas Eve, a rare snowfall blanketed the ranch in white. Xavier arrived at the house carrying a small pine tree he'd cut from the property's northern edge. "Thought we should have a proper Christmas," he explained as Fiona stared in surprise. "My mother always said a house wasn't a home at Christmas without a tree." Together, they set up the tree in the corner of the sitting room and decorated it with the few ornaments Fiona's mother had collected years ago, delicate glass balls and paper stars that had been carefully preserved in tissue paper. Xavier added carved wooden animals he had made himself over the previous weeks: a horse, a cow, a bird in flight. "They're beautiful," Fiona said, touching the intricate carving of the horse. "I didn't know you were so talented." Xavier shrugged, a faint blush coloring his cheeks. "Just something to keep my hands busy in the evenings." When the tree was decorated, they sat before the fire, sharing a cup of spiced cider Xavier had prepared using a recipe from his childhood. Outside, the snow continued to fall, wrapping the ranch in a blanket of pristine white. "I have something for you," Xavier said, reaching into his pocket. "It's not much, but—" He handed her a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a length of red ribbon. Fiona unwrapped it carefully to reveal a hand-carved wooden box, its lid inlaid with a perfect miniature of the Bennett ranch house. "Oh, Xav," she breathed, running her fingers over the intricate carving. "It's wonderful." "Open it," he urged, watching her face closely. Inside the box, nestled on a bed of soft cloth, lay a simple silver ring set with a small, perfect turquoise stone. Fiona's breath caught in her throat as she looked from the ring to Xavier's face. "It was my mother's," he explained, his voice husky with emotion. "The only thing of value I kept when I sold the ranch. I've carried it with me all these years, waiting for the right person to give it to." He took the box from her hands and carefully removed the ring. Then, to Fiona's surprise, he slid from his chair to one knee before her. "Fiona Bennett," he said, his blue eyes steady on hers, I know we haven't known each other long by some standards, but out here, time measures differently. A season together on this land is worth years in softer places. He took her hand in his. I love you, Fiona. Your strength, your heart, your determination. I love the way you care for this land and everything on it. I love that you can be both gentle and fierce in the same moment, and I would be honored if you would agree to be my wife. Tears blurred Fiona's vision as she looked at this man kneeling before her, this good, honorable man who had come into her life when she thought herself destined to be alone. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, Xavier Caldwell, I will marry you. His face lit with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, the turquoise stone catching the firelight with a warm glow. Xavier rose to his feet, drawing Fiona up with him, and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart swell. Merry Christmas, my love, he murmured against her lips. Merry Christmas, Xav, she replied, certain that no Christmas gift could ever mean more than this man and the future they would build together. They were married on the first day of spring, 1883, in the small church in Prescott. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, attended by the few neighbors whose ranches bordered the Bennett property and several of Xavier's friends from his cattle driving days. Fiona wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her taller frame, and carried wildflowers gathered from the meadow near the ranch house. As they exchanged vows, Fiona looked into Xavier's eyes and saw the future reflected their years of working side by side, building the ranch into something that would last, creating a family together on the land her father had loved. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the minister declared. You may kiss your bride. Xavier's kiss was tender and reverent, a promise of all the days to come. The spring and summer that followed were the happiest of Fiona's life. With Xavier by her side, the ranch flourished. They expanded the herd, added several fine horses for breeding, and repaired the main house, making it more comfortable while preserving the character her parents had established. In the evenings, they would often sit on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in spectacular colors. Sometimes they talked of the day's work or made plans for the future. Other times, they simply sat in comfortable silence, Xavier's arm around Fiona's shoulders, her head resting against him. On one such evening in late summer, as the first hints of autumn crispened the air, Fiona turned to her husband with a smile that held a secret. I was thinking, she said casually, that we might need to add a room to the house before next spring. Xavier looked at her quizzically. A room. What for? Her smile widened. For the newest member of the Caldwell family, the one who should arrive around April if the doctor in Prescott is correct. For a moment, Xavier stared at her blankly. Then understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by a joy so pure it took Fiona's breath away. A baby, he whispered, his hand moving instinctively to rest on her still flat stomach. We're having a baby, Fiona nodded, covering his hand with her own. We are you happy? In answer, Xavier pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. Happy doesn't begin to cover it, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Overjoyed, terrified, grateful beyond words. He drew back to look into her eyes, his own suspiciously bright. Thank you, Fiona, for making me the happiest man in the Arizona Territory. Thank you for finding me, she replied softly, for sitting beside me when I needed someone most. As twilight deepened around them, Fiona thought back to that evening nearly a year ago when a dust-covered cowboy had ridden up to her fence and changed her life forever. How lonely she had been then, how weighted down by responsibility and grief. And how different everything was now, with Xavier's steady presence beside her and new life growing within her. The ranch that had been her burden had become their shared joy, a legacy they would pass on to their children and their children's children. What had once been merely a place to survive had become truly a home, filled with love and hope for the future. As if reading her thoughts, Xavier tightened his arm around her shoulders. Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Caldwell, Fiona smiled, leaning into his embrace. I was just thinking how fortunate I am that you happened to ride by that evening. Not fortune, Xavier corrected gently. Fate. I was always meant to find you, Fiona Bennett, to sit beside you forever. Together they watched as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, their light a promise of all the good nights yet to come. 5 years later, Fiona sat on the same fence post where Xavier had first found her, watching as her husband taught their 4-year-old son Frederick how to brush down his pony. Little Freddie's serious expression as he concentrated on the task was so like his father's that it made Fiona's heart swell with love. From the house behind her came the sound of 2-year-old Catherine's delighted laughter, as she played with the wooden animals Xavier had carved for her. Soon, there would be another child to join them, the new life that had just begun to make its presence known in the slight rounding of Fiona's stomach. The Bennett Caldwell ranch had prospered beyond anything Fiona could have imagined that lonely evening when Xavier rode into her life. The herd had tripled in size, they'd built a reputation for quality horses throughout the territory, and the main house had been expanded to accommodate their growing family. But the true measure of their success, Fiona knew, wasn't in cattle or acres or buildings. It was in the love that filled every corner of the ranch, the love between husband and wife, parents and children, and for the land that sustained them all. Xavier looked up, catching her eye across the yard. His smile, still as warm and genuine as the day they met, never failed to make her heart skip a beat. He said something to Freddie, then crossed to where Fiona sat, his long strides eating up the distance between them. "What are you doing out here, love?" he asked, resting his hands on either side of her on the fence post. "Dr. Simmons said you should be resting." Fiona smiled, touching his cheek gently. "I'm perfectly fine, just wanted some fresh air and the chance to watch my handsome men at work." Xavier's eyes, as blue as the Arizona sky above them, crinkled at the corners as he returned her smile. "Is that so, and what do you think of our work?" "I think," she said softly, "that I'm the luckiest woman in the Arizona territory." He leaned forward, pressing a tender kiss to her lips. "And I'm the luckiest man. Every day I thank God for bringing me to this fence post." Fiona wrapped her arms around his neck, breathing in the familiar scent of leather, pine, and home. "Do you remember what you asked me that first evening?" "I do," Xavier replied, his voice low and intimate. "I asked if you wanted me to sit beside you forever. And here we are," she said simply. Xavier's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer. "Here we are, and here we'll stay, building our forever one day at a time." As the setting sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Fiona knew with absolute certainty that she had found the answer to the question she hadn't even known. She was asking that fateful evening the question of whether true love could find her in this wild, beautiful, unforgiving land. The answer was yes, 1,000 times yes.